Rents were generally pretty stable between 2015 and 2020, and the same was with home prices. They decreased through the financial recession, and then were pretty stable through 2020, and then we see that in both rents and prices, there was a big jump of about a 50% jump between 2020 and 2023, 2022, and then prices begin to moderate again. And this trend we see across the country is not just specific to Las Cruces. And then in terms of vacancies, we see that there was a very high vacancy or higher vacancy environment in 2010 and in 2017, but that's really turned in 2024. For rental vacancy rates, we would like to see them around 5% to be able to allow the churn in the market that allows renters to, find housing and at the price that they want and be able to have options. And that's, in Las Cruces, it's at 3.5, so that's significantly lower. And then on the homeownership side, we would expect to see about a 2% vacancy rate, and that's also below the 2% mark. So we're seeing that the vacancies show tight markets in Las Cruces. And then the analysis has more data shown by different price levels, and at lower price levels, there's even tighter vacancy trends. And I'll pass it to Heidi to talk about the survey findings that we conducted for both the consolidated plan and the affordable housing plan.
Thank you, Avilia. I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the engagement that we did to support these two plans, and then I will pass it back to Avilia to talk about projected needs. So she's going to get into a deep dive in terms of what to expect in the future and the types of housing that people will need. You're going to come back to me for a bit of a wrap-up. So to support the consolidated plans, so the HUD required plan as well as the state plan, we conducted a residence survey. We got a really good response, almost 800 responses. 70% of them lived in Las Cruces, so we have a really good sample to analyze about needs. Your homeowner, the share that were homeowners is pretty much on track with your homeownership rate. 25% are renters. If you're doing some math and you figure out that doesn't add up to 100%, the balance of those are people who what we call are precariously housed. So they're overcrowded, they're living with friends or family, they might be in a tent, they're living out of their car. They're people who are very housing unstable. About a third of respondents were over 65. Another third, or the similar third, there's some overlap there, had a disability. 13% single parents. 29% said they lived in an overcrowded household. 62% identified as of Hispanic descent. And a little more than a third were very low income, so had incomes of under $25,000. We ask a number of questions that are captured. The total analysis is captured in Appendix A of your packet. But just to give you a highlight of some of the most important takeaways from the survey, I wanted to start with those living in poor or fair housing condition. We asked people to self-assess the condition of their housing. Then we also asked them if they say, I live in poor or fair housing condition, what improvements are needed. This gives you what we call a crosstab, so those responses by demographic groups. The headline here is that precariously housed and single parents reported the highest rates of living in poor or fair housing condition. 40% of respondents to the survey that were either single parents or precariously housed said they live in poor or fair condition housing. We asked what people need. They said cosmetic improvements, cooling systems, interior walls were a pretty high need, particularly among people living in mobile homes. And when we talk about, we ask people with disabilities what type of accessibility improvements they need. The top needs were grab bars, ramps, alarms to notify if somebody with a cognitive or behavioral disability leaves the house. We also ask a question about displacement. We don't use the term displacement, but we ask people, have you needed to move or had to move in the last 5 years when you didn't want to? Overall, 13% of respondents to the survey said they did have to move in the last 5 years when they didn't want to. Those who are currently precariously housed, renters, single parents, and those with a disability had the highest rates of displacement in response to this question. On the right-hand side here, under the reasons for displacement, I would invite you to take a look at that box. We had an unusual response based on surveys. We do these types of surveys all over the country. And we learned in Las Cruces the top reason for being displaced was losing a job or having hours cut back. Almost almost always see the most common reason being that rent increased. So we're in an interesting economic situation right now, and we definitely are seeing that reflected in the displacement question. We also ask people, what do you need to feel more secure in your housing? And this shows you those responses by household type. Many people said, I need rental assistance, I need help paying rent. That was true of people with disability, people living in overcrowded households. But we also saw that people said they needed to make money to make critical repairs, and that was true of our large households, people of Hispanic descent. You'll notice here in the over 65, so the senior population and the non-Hispanic white population, the majority of folks said, I don't need anything. That tells us that those folks are more likely to be housing stable than other demographic groups. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Avilia, and she's going to get into some of the data findings and projected needs.
Thank you. So in terms of affordability, this figure here shows what the average annual wage is in the county for different industries, as well as what can they afford to rent and to buy. And then how does that compare with what we are seeing in the market in terms of the median or the typical rent and home prices? So here we can see that at the average wages with one earner, people are generally able to afford the median rent. However, there are a few industries, including leisure and hospitality, where that is not the case. And these industries don't represent a really small share of the county jobs. They actually represent around close to 20% of county jobs on the rental side. And then when things get really dim is on the purchase affordability. So with one earner, at the average annual wage, none of the industries can afford to transition to homeownership. And then with two earners, now we're seeing a few industries, financial activities, professional business services, and public administration being able to afford this, but these are not the industries that are expected to grow a lot in the future or that have been growing a lot in the past. So things are really tied on getting these renters into the homeownership side. And then the next two exercises are called market gaps. We did it both in the rental and in the rental to own market. And it shows the distribution of renters by income, as well as the distribution of units that are affordable to them by income, and then the shortage of the surplus for each of the income levels. So we can see here that in 2024, there was a rental gap of almost 4,500 units in Las Cruces for households earnings up to 30% AMI, and in the county, this gap was a little bit higher, but most of the gap is concentrated in the city, and it's really concentrated on the 0 to 30% AMI. So those very, very low-income households that need rents at the sub 500 level. It's important to know that at the 120 and over 150% of the area median income, those red numbers don't mean that these people are cost burden or that they don't have units. What it means is that they are occupying units that would be affordable to lower income households. So then that creates another sort of distortion in the market. Oh, I don't know what happened to the ownership side, but I do have the numbers if we want to discuss them later. In terms of population projections, we see that the county is it's expected to continue to gain population through 2040 with a slight decrease in 2050. And we also see that the number of residents under age 20 and young adults is expected to keep decreasing, while the population age 35 to 64 will remain the largest. But we are going to see a significant increase, particularly of those age 75 and older. And again, this is in line with what's happening at the state level and at the national level as well. What does that mean in terms of projected affordability needs? We did an analysis where holding the share of the population that lives in the city constant, so around 51%, if we assume that the city will hold to that share of the population within the county, then based on the household formation rates by age in 2023, these are the number of units that we would need to accommodate the growth in household if the city were to continue to keep its AMI distribution, so basically without displacing all the low-income households. So then you would need 4 units below 30% AMI, 675 rental units, and 225 ownership units, and this is between 2025 and 2045, so in the next 20 years. And then for 30 to 50%, 428 units and 161 ownership units. For 50 to 80%, we have 521 rental units and 375 ownership units. And for households with incomes between 80 and 100%, 193 rental units and 245 rental units. Some of these units will become affordable as older residents age in place, and this is specifically the case for the very low AMI ownership units. We don't expect those units to be produced by the market, but others will require tenant subsidies. Those are the lower AMI rental units, and others will need to be added through new construction of affordable units and filtering of older units into more affordable price brackets. In terms of how this compares to the city's building permit rates in the last couple of years, it's actually very, it looks very good. You've been building more than what's projected to be needed. The problem is reaching those affordability levels, especially at the 0 to 30% AMI. And then we'll leave you with the consolidated plan update.
So I'm going to wrap up with some of the events that are happening the next 2 days. Before I do that, I do want to acknowledge all the great things that the city's been doing. You definitely are a model for the types of units that you've been building, the kind of investments you've been making to help stabilize very low-income individuals, and you see that in the data. Your needs are going down, you still have them, and we're up here presenting the negative because we're telling you what people told us they still have in terms of needs, but I don't want that to overshadow all the wonderful things the city's been doing. The consolidated plan, as Avi mentioned earlier, is the HUD required plan. It is out for draft comment now. There's a 30-day comment period that is required of the federal government. And this is a plan that tells the community how you propose to spend your block grants. Those are the Community Development Block Grant and the Home Investment Partnerships Program. So you're required to come to the community and let them know how you intend to spend those dollars, what your vision is over 5 years, and how you propose to spend them the next year. One specific requirement of the consolidated plan is that it has to meet critical needs. And in terms of critical needs, we often look at that in terms of poverty. I had talked a lot earlier about what people told us their needs were. Avilia talked a bit about what the community survey out of the census is telling us. And this gives you a sense, it's a more sort of dialed in specific need for the consolidated plan. These data pieces are they're coming from different sources, but they're all telling us the same thing, which is single moms, single parents have very high rates of poverty and are very likely to be housing unstable. Your poverty rate went up a little bit over the last 5 years, but you have done a really nice job when you think of looking at that gap that Avi talked about, providing housing and stability for those people who are making less than 30% of the AMI. People with disabilities also have very high poverty rates, and as we saw in the survey, they need accessibility improvements and rental assistance to become housing stable. And that's what the consolidated plan focuses on. This gives you the 2026, so the 1-year funding allocation that is proposed for the CDBG and the HOME program. Those federal programs have specific requirements about the activities that you can invest in, and this is the city's proposal to distribute those funds across a wide variety of categories. CDBG would primarily be invested in home rehabilitation activities, as well as public infrastructure and public facilities, so improvement of a playground, some weatherization improvements, A portion of CDBG, 15%, 15%, can be used to help social service providers who work with special needs populations and people with people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, stabilize their population. Starting with the Mesilla Valley Community of Hope, you see the proposed allocation of CDBG dollars to public service activities to be able to assist those high needs individuals. For home, that's the housing program, so those dollars are invested in both the creation of new home ownership opportunities. Las Cruces is pretty innovative for that use of home. A lot of our clients pair home to provide more leverage to create low-income housing tax credit projects. You here are proposing that a share of those dollars go toward home ownership opportunities, and Avilia talked about that need. The balance of those home funds will be allocated or proposed to be allocated to tenant-based rental assistance. So thinking back to one of the top needs in the survey, rental assistance was a very high need among the lowest income populations, and the distribution of home dollars would help address that. So your input is next, but before we transition to that, I just want folks to know there are 4 opportunities for input for the consolidated plan and the 2026 proposed spending plan. 2 of those are tomorrow, 2 of those are on Wednesday. They will be held at Sage Cafe, at the Senior Center, at the Community of Hope, and then closing out on McClure Road. We're holding those in the afternoon as well as in the evening to give people a variety of opportunities to come. There's also an opportunity to email us, email Natalie, call us, give us public input over the next 30 days. Following that public input, the end of that public input, we will consider any comments, make any changes to the consolidated plan, and then submit that to HUD. That is required to be submitted by May 15th. So with that, we'll take questions and open it up to discussion.
Councilor Harris.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So yeah, very, very interesting presentation. It's nice to see kind of the general feeling of living in this town, actually with some actual numbers behind it. I have a few comments and questions. So on slide 4, our packet here I think is one off from yours. So 14 or 15 maybe. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I think this should be a pretty eye-opening slide for everyone who lives or wants to live in town, that nobody can afford a median home in this town, right? That's kind of the takeaway. Unless you have 2 incomes and then only in certain industries. I personally I would struggle to afford my own house again. I bought it in 2017, and it would be very challenging for me to afford that at its current value. So yeah, I think that's very eye-opening, and just want to let the true meaning of this slide sink in. So I guess related to that, I think on 15. So when we're talking about the gaps here, I think you said that so 121 and over 150% AMI, there's red numbers, which are a negative gap, which means that theoretically, if we had more higher end units, that there are folks who would be able to afford $2,000 a month in rent and would pay it. And if we had 3,000 more, like, I guess I would say luxury apartments, like they would move there instead of where they're currently at, and that those would trickle down. Is that kind of the Mr. Mayor and council members, to answer that question, there's quite an ongoing debate about that, whether or not something called filtering. So would people move into the right priced housing for their income if those units were available? A lot of times with folks who are earning that much money, they tend to rent down because they're saving. They're trying to get a down payment saved for a house. They may have childcare needs, they have medical needs.
So in theory, yes, there is an opportunity to provide housing at that level. Whether or not people would take advantage of that and move into those higher priced units would be their personal preference.
Yeah, okay, that's kind of what I was thinking. Back when I rented for a very long time, and I kind of did that personally. Like, I moved up into what was at the time a very expensive apartment for town, which is now barely on this list, which is quite unfortunate. But yeah, I could have probably moved, and so I was just asking if that's what the takeaway should be, and I'm hearing that it's probably not what the takeaway should be because it's debatable, and I think from my own personal experience, I would agree that that's probably not what we should take away from this. So I guess with that in mind, what would you say some of the blockers are for creating, like, if we wanted to create housing at a certain price point? Do you have suggestions about what we can do, or is that not really in the scope of this report? Or
It is in the scope, and it's forthcoming as we wrap up the affordable housing plan. It's not necessarily captured in the HUD document or required of the HUD document because that's real specific to those funding sources. The city has an investment strategy that has guided its work over the last few years that I think is fair to say has been very successful. So the city's been really strategic about using city dollars and also state dollars, applying for funds, leveraging those, and then keeping that money flowing by trying to structure properties in a way that they don't have so much debt that you can roll over those grant funds and keep applying and keep building homes. So I would argue that the city's recent track record of investing in the right types of housing and building housing that's needed, and I think Natalie can speak more to the lease-up rates, but I would argue that they're showing that that's very successful. In addition to continuing to invest in low-income homeownership opportunities to create more stable housing and move people into homeownership who want to achieve that, are really central to being able to meet needs. That 0 to 30%, though, in those truly housing unstable folks who are moving a lot, who are precariously housed, need both housing and supportive services. So they need a little more of a sort of a bigger package of delivery of housing. So public services are key for that. One of the I would say challenges to being able to meet their needs in particular is the federal funds that came in after the pandemic to stabilize the economy were really useful and were put to great use for a lot of different housing opportunities. Those obviously are going away. There may not be funds like that in the future. So that just the funding constraint to be able to continue the good work the city's doing, particularly from the federal level, I think will be a big challenge.
Okay, and I guess more broadly speaking, are there policies that the city should consider enacting to stabilize prices or to influence the private markets of housing? I guess back to the affordability example, that apartment that I lived in, when I moved in, the rent actually went down in the 9 years that I lived there. And since then, it has doubled. And that owner built the property with a certain business model and certain rents. And like I said, even during that time, they reevaluated everybody's rents and were like, you know what, maybe we don't actually have to be charging some fees that we're charging, and got rid of those. And then in 8 years, they're just like, well, cool, rent is now twice as expensive. Thanks. So.
And I'll invite Avilia to talk a little bit about this, but one of the things you can do, which she acknowledges, is keeping up with demand. So you have done a really good job. The city's pretty unusual relative to a lot of cities in building, in permitting units, in keeping up with your household growth. Avilia we've talked a little bit earlier, though, about some of the comments that she had received from interviews that she'd done Avilia is doing work in Santa Fe as well, where we had developers say, just model Las Cruces. Las Cruces' new comprehensive plan in your code. We have some minor recommendations for changes to the code, which will come out with the affordable housing plan. But for the most part, it feels like those changes have been very well received, and you're seeing that in the return of development, appropriate development.
Nice. That's great to hear. And yeah, I think the new code is a model for cities everywhere, and it sounds like we're getting that feedback. So I guess to that end, some of the highest needs were repairs, interior and exterior repairs. Was there concern? I guess what are the blockers there? Is it more money? Is it permitting? Is it I want to add on a little bit, but it's hard to get it permitted, or maybe was difficult to get it through the new code, and maybe we're doing stuff that's helping now.
We ask people, why haven't the repairs been made? And most people say, I couldn't afford it. Yeah. Occasionally among renters, people say they are afraid to tell the property owner for fear of being evicted or a rent increase. And so there is a segment of the renter population, largely low-income renters, who will just tolerate units in fair or poor condition because they're afraid their rent will go up.
Yeah, that's something I hope to be in the report, and something I want to look at is ways that we can, kind of encourage landlords to improve their properties, but at the same time assuage fears of rent increases and make sure that, if we want people to live in a certain minimum standard, that's not an excuse for somebody to be like, well, I need to, spend an extra $1,000 to upgrade this unit, so I'm going to double your rent. We want to make sure that doesn't happen, but it'd be interesting to see in the report. Sorry, I've taken a lot of time, so I'll give it up for now. Thanks.
Other questions or comments? Councilor Curran.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation and super interesting information, I think, in terms of compelling us to keep moving forward. And I know I really appreciate seeing the affordability index. I know I hear that from my students all the time, like, I will never buy a house. That's not a thing that will happen for me. And I teach at the community college, and that's pretty depressing, especially when in theory you're training folks to get a better wage, but that wage will never match the cost of buying a home. It's a bleak picture that I'm glad that we're making efforts to address. But I was wondering if you could speak about two specific things, or one thing and then a secondary thing. I think home and CBGB, however you say, are both up for some discussion in the federal sort of funding area, just this, I think, right now. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that means in our context specifically, or if you have a sense for what that means in our context. And then secondarily, I think part of the question about mobile homes and or livability in places that may not be traditional homes in the way we think of them, or large apartment complexes in the ways that we think about them. I don't know that they have the same access to certain types of funding or support historically, or if I misunderstand that, but I don't think we can use some of that federal funding in the case of supporting people who have mobile homes the same way we could for someone who has a home that they're trying to improve or make more livable, that's on a foundation. So I'm wondering if you can talk about those two things, the federal funding thing, and then also a little bit about mobile homes. I think mobile home, I feel like we have a little bit of a blind spot in our plan or work that mobile home folks are really particularly vulnerable in a lot of cases. So I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for those questions. I would also like to acknowledge, which is not in the slides, the survey slides that I presented today. We do ask renters about the barriers to home ownership, and we've got quite a bit of detail there. And it is inability to come up with a down payment assistance is a big one, and so there are programs that you can utilize for that, or I'm afraid I won't be able to afford a mortgage payment. On the federal bill, there are two bills in the federal bills. There are two bills in Congress right now. One is the Housing for the 21st Century, I think, which was the House bill, and the Road to Home, I may get this a little off, was in the Senate. Those are moving forward. I think they're in reconciliation. I might be wrong about that, but your mayor's probably there and would know, is probably involved with this. Those should, a couple things that those do, I think they would codify CDBG-DR, which is the disaster recovery portion of it, which we haven't talked about disaster risk, but we do acknowledge that quite a bit in the consolidated plan, and we talked to county folks about it quite a bit as we were preparing this plan. So codifying CDBG-DR is huge because that would allow CDBG dollars to come in and address a lot of rehabilitation, rebuilding, infrastructure. There are some modest changes to CDBG, and this is a point of much reconciliation that broadens CDBG to be able to use, to invest in housing activities more. One, the Senate bill actually ties the continued receipt of CDBG to making progress on housing supply. So it has a penalty if for communities, and I just saw an analysis a couple weeks ago that looked at the communities where dollars would be taken away. Las Cruces is one of those to my memory, but it would penalize communities that are not keeping up with housing supply and take away some of their CDBG. So it does have a pretty aggressive, this is not, this type of thinking around CDBG as a homeownership tool has not occurred to my knowledge since the program was put into place in the 70s. So there's some positives there. There's also a lot of reform for home to make home's a complicated program and it's difficult to use. And my understanding is there's some reforms that would make home a little more efficient.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up because that is a big topic of conversation and why we have to keep on, I think, thinking about this in this context. I don't know if
I'm going to pass it to Natalie
Sorry.
to answer.
But
no,
I didn't
to
mean
answer
to
the
put
manufactured
you all on the
home
spot.
question.
It just seems very germane at the moment. So.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Cran. So we have looked at, we can use some of our CDBG to work on mobile homes. We primarily do ADA ramp improvements for that. We could look at, we have thrown around a replacement program for mobile homes. We just want to make sure that if we take out a mobile home and put a new one, that somehow the other one is disposed of or eliminated from the housing market in its entirety. So if it's not, we just don't want to see those get recycled in the open market in the future. And then we would have to retool the home rehab program because, and it'd be almost, we'd have to put some thought into it because we currently secure the repairs of our home rehab program against the property, and so we'd have to structure it a little bit differently for mobile homes in a mobile home park. So it's not outside of the possibility. We would just have to figure it out.
Thank you. And I'm not necessarily saying that I think we should embark on a new venture. I just think it's an area where hearing some of what's been reflected here and thinking about what's going on with some of the most vulnerable people I think that I've heard from in my district, there is a lot of exploitation and fluidity in the mobile home market that leads to people being in even more tenuous housing situations down the road. So I just was curious to hear about that. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other comments, questions? Councilor Bencomo.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work on this. Just having lots of thoughts about what all of this means and how, we can put it to good use. I think there's a couple of takeaways for me that I'll name before I just have a couple of questions. I feel like for me, the two biggest takeaways are access, regardless of income, that there is just not enough, right? There is just not enough rental units, whether it's affordable units or fair market price units for people who can afford the higher end apartments, if you will. So just like access to actual quantity. And the second one is access because of economic anxiety. And I spoke briefly about this at the budget retreat around, so maybe not so much policies and ordinances that will incentivize more building, because I think we already did that with Realize, but really more policies and programs that go towards economic mobility of our community. Like I'm, page 8, our page 8, the fact that in the survey there was 36% had household income of less than 25,000 to me is deeply concerning. And I think that to me poverty is a policy choice. Like, I deeply believe that that's true. And what else could we be doing to improve the quality of life and the economic mobility of so many of our families, whether they're families, they're single folks, whoever they are, single parents, people who are living in overcrowded households, whatever the case is, that to me feels like a huge undertaking that we really must explore. And that's probably outside of the scope of your work with us, but I think that is important for us as council and city management and Natalie and a lot of us here to really try to tackle, because that to me is deeply concerning, and we'll probably see even more why in the economic outlook after this. And then, as I think about things like the Family Prosperity Program, which I'm a huge advocate for and have been for a long time, part of that is because of this huge concern that we're seeing in terms of access because of economic anxiety that our communities facing. And then on page 11, our page 11, when I'm thinking about, okay, what would you need to be able to secure housing, rental assistance, money to make critical repairs is consistently the top two. So it's money, it's cash in people's pockets that could make their lives so much more stable. And to me, this is, to me, the biggest takeaway. And, I had talked about at the budget retreat, I wasn't even prepared to have this sort of aha moment, but at the budget retreat, I did speak about, institutionalizing the Family Prosperity Program, because we had a pilot project that was tremendously successful with a couple of nonprofit organizations, and I just think it's incumbent upon us to think about institutionalizing it and making it permanent. And I know what folks will say, or folks who don't believe in such a program will say, but the numbers are right in front of us. Like, this is what people are struggling with the most in order to have more secure and stable housing. And us as municipal government should absolutely take that as a challenge and a responsibility to try to address. So I just wanted to name that. And I think, Natalie, I have a couple of questions for you, probably, actually. As I see the numbers for, an aging population, we also know that, and I don't know if this changed, I think this was as of last year, that our unhoused population is also more and more seniors experiencing homelessness. Is that, to me, this is very concerning, right? That, like, again, lack of access to just actual access to housing with an aging population. And, I think we're making huge strides at that, but I am curious if you can speak to that concern a little bit.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Bencomo. So yes, we do anticipate that senior homelessness population will continue to rise, and the plan does have a specific section, if I'm correct, on housing needs assessment for people experiencing homelessness. I do just want to give some next steps too. So after we present this plan and have our 30-day comment period, we'll adopt the consolidated plan, and our 26 action plan. We'll be submitting that to HUD for review and their corrections if there is any. And then we'll shift focus to the affordable housing plan, which will have targeted objectives for each housing type and each housing population. As staff, we will use that to inform our affordable housing programming moving forward. So when developers come to us, rather than them telling us what they're building, we're going to tell them, you need to build X, Y, Z, or we are supporting projects that prioritize X, Y, Z. So we'll work on finalizing that plan with Heidi and Avila. I'm gonna get it right. We'll work on adopting that and submitting that to Housing New Mexico. And then on top of that, our plan is to bring back all the feedback within both plans, and then work on some ordinance and policy changes, both programming wise and then whatever we need to do in terms of the affordable housing general oversight ordinance. And then we'll work on some project implementation to address the strategic plans within both planning documents. So we're very much about implementation, so we don't let our plans sit on the shelf. We
That's
like to
right.
implement
Thank
our
you.
plans, and so you'll see that work moving forward. But we are concerned about seniors.
Mm-hmm.
We saw it with Padrina. We were 90% leased up day one.
Mm-hmm.
We are seeing it a little bit with Peachtree, so we had 142 applications for 144 units.
Repeat that?
We had 142 applications, and then there's only 144 units. So in the lease-up data or the application data, phase one has less 3-bedrooms. There's more 3-bedrooms in phase two. We had 42 applications for 18 3-bedroom units. And then for the public who may watch this later, we still have availability in the 1-bedroom, so we're looking to fill those. But certainly the need is telling in those pre-leasing numbers for all of the housing developments.
Yeah, that is very telling, Natalie. Thank you. When can we expect to see the affordable housing plan?
Ooh, do we have a timeline?
We have draft sections which will go to review of Natalie and her team. So I would say a month to a month and a half before we get through the review process and then the
Okay.
recommendations.
And then I assume we'll have a work session as well, Natalie? Yes, great. Thank you for that. I think those were all of my questions. I'm wondering, obviously this is really great data, and I know that we have another very localized survey happening. I'm wondering I don't know if the public health coordinator can speak to how, that group plans to coordinate with this. And if they're not here, it seems like. Okay.
Mayor Pro Tem Munoz and Councilor Mincoma, I can have Anthony, I can text them to come down if you'd like. And he can
That's
choose
okay.
it.
I think we're probably moving on, but I think this is an important conversation for a public health coordinator to be at in the future, especially as we have our, the mayor's project on the survey here locally. I think I want us to make sure these aren't siloed and that they're moving in conjunction together. So I think to me that feels particularly important. And yeah, I do think that is all of my questions. I feel like I had one more, but now I lost my train of thought. So thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilor Bencomo. On page 9, and thank you, Avilia, Heidi, Natalie. We've pronounced your name like 5 different ways here, so we'll get it right. We'll get it right. I grew up in the 1900s. Well, 1990s, and we, the common thought then was you're going to get a job and you'll get a home, and so it pains me to hear my son who just graduated from college and his contemporaries say, "I'll never afford a home, and I don't know that I'll get into a house." So obviously we have some work to do together to look at this solution holistically. So I wanted to talk about the pressure that you see under tenure where it says precariously housed. The population distribution is 18% at 65 plus. 75 plus will continue to grow in addition to 65 plus. I know that, as Councilor Harris mentioned or alluded to, I think it's important for landlords who have swamp coolers still to be aware of climate and the environment. It seems like we went from winter to summer all of a sudden. And they want happy tenants and tenants who are comfortable. And so I think that's important as we look at cooling initiatives throughout the city. I sit on a board. We raise money and we contribute money to help out seniors in our city who need things like grab bars, air conditioning, and ramps. It's so hard to get around. And I've been fortunate. I'm not as handy, so I'm really helping, move around tools and materials and things like that. But I've had the opportunity to visit some sites, and it is difficult to see, where our seniors who've been there, who've raised us, who've been there for us, are struggling to get around. and you go into their homes, and it is just sweltering hot. And they request things like air conditioning, ramps, and grab bars. And so we're able to fund that as a nonprofit, but we can't be reaching a big portion of what's happening in Las Cruces. So I just wanted to hear from you, what pressure do you think you see under tenured, precariously housed homes? What pressure do you see on the market?
Sorry, we're discussing who's best to answer this.
Or both of y'all, yes, that's fine.
In terms of the seniors' needs, definitely the grab bars, the cooling systems, those overlap a lot with disability. And so the incidence of disability once a senior turns 75 goes up dramatically. I do think there's a bit of a myth that we want to move seniors out of their homes and then they'll become available to people like your son to become homeowners. Most surveys show that seniors do want to stay in place. And in fact, your survey, I didn't present this data, but showed that the majority of folks do want to stay in their home as long as they can because they're very happy with where they're living. So that does give you even more, of an impetus to continue the rehabilitation work that you're doing and address the cooling and the grab bar, the accessibility needs. And I'll let Natalie talk a little more about that.
Mayor Pro Tem, I just wanted to give, so I think we're in our second, going into our third year of the emergency handyman program. So we specifically launched that program using general funds to be able to do emergency repairs for seniors so they can stay in place. So that handles heating and cooling during the changeovers. We've also used it some for accessibility and some other things that we determined to be life and safety hazards. It is currently slated to be funded in this year's budget through our general fund. And then real quickly, because I didn't get a chance, I just wanted, my entire team is here, so I'm hoping they'll stand and just wave, because they are the team that does the work day in and day out. And so they are managing the home rehab program, the emergency repair program, our home TBRA program, well, really all the programs. They do all the work. I stand up here and talk to you guys. So we do have a program specifically to address that outside of federal funds, because there's no federal funds can be incredibly challenging to deploy. So we do have some flexible funding that'll let us address those. And if there's opportunities to partner with other nonprofits, we're always happy to incorporate that into our programming.
Would love to. Thank you. Well, thank you, Natalie, to you and to your team as well for all the wonderful work that you do. And thank you, Heidi and Avila? Okay, we'll get it. Sorry. We'll stand corrected for the record. We'll get your pronunciation correctly. Well, thank you very much. If no other, yes, Councilor McClure.
I just wanted to point out, Anthony did make a rundown here, so if he wanted to add to the conversation a little bit, I didn't want to.
Mayor Pro Tem, maybe I can reiterate what I was going to ask. Hello.
Sure.
I just, I think as we are talking about this, and there's a lot of survey information in here as well, I just wonder, I'm curious how you're thinking. I know that you're spearheading that project, and so I'm just curious how you're approaching that, and then making sure that, we're working together with this plan and the plan that's upcoming.
Yes, indeed. Anthony Turner, Public Health Coordinator, Mayor Pro Tem Council. The survey that you're mentioning is actually being developed right now in partnership with NMSU. We're waiting on their proposal, and then we'll move forward with that. But at the moment, while it's in the development phases, there's not too much to that.
Just so I'm clear, Anthony, that'll be specifically for unhoused folks, or are you thinking of expanding that to all folks who are, for example, living in maybe on
It'll be
couch
for
surfing, or living in their car? Or
it'll be for all four categories
Yeah.
of the HUD
Okay.
homelessness.
Okay.
Also with substance abuse and mental health. So it covers a wide range. So there's
Okay.
going to be quite a bit of data in that we have to cover.
Okay, thank you. Do you know if we will have access to the survey before it goes out? Like, will we be able to provide feedback?
Yes, we will be able to provide feedback, but right now I believe that Dr. Banner is going to be the principal investigator
Okay.
helping to develop it.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
Councilor Harris.
Thanks. Actually, another follow-up on surveys, and this is for anybody who conducts surveys, maybe everybody. So there were 742 respondents to this. There's 110, 120,000 people who live in the city. How do we go about doing our surveys? Do we have thoughts or how we might improve numbers?
This is Heidi Agler again, Mayor Pro Tem and council members. In this kind of a survey, what we're looking at, we call this a snowball survey. So we get the word out about the survey. People hopefully tell each other. It picks up like some energy, like a snowball rolling down a hill. I don't know if that's the right physics, but that's what we say. And then the survey kind of, the word of the survey broadens and people get excited to take it. This is the appropriate type of survey to do for a housing needs assessment of this size and magnitude, because what we're trying to get is capture, and you see we captured like those precariously housed and the very low income people very well. We want their voices captured in the survey. In some cases, and we're doing this right now for a community outside of Washington, D.C., we'll do a statistical survey, a significant survey, so we use a more precise sample to be able to invite people to take the survey. That type of survey on its own is quite expensive to conduct, just the sampling in particular. So what we hope to do with this survey, which we achieved, is use the snowball type of approach and the sort of just informal promotion with the city as a partner and nonprofits as a partner to get enough of a representation of the people who have housing needs, which we did. So it's not as a matter of the numbers as the representation of that demographic sample. With the statistically significant survey, like the magic number for those, just to give you some context, is about 400 responses. And for this one, we got 742. So we feel really good about the numbers, but also the demographic representation.
Okay, yeah.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Harris, I will add that for this particular survey, staff does make a concerted effort to outreach those least likely to participate. So we mailed about 10,000 postcards to low to moderate income census tracts. In addition to that, we partnered with Casa de Peregrinos, who put survey flyers in all of the food pantry boxes. So that was about 6,000 households. And then we partnered with the county on ads. So for those who see the bulletin weekly, we advertised and they advertised, and then it was also on both Facebook posts. And then I actually did a news TV segment with our communications team that was advertised on the news. So we do try and go above and beyond the standard outreach process.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. And I appreciate the focus on the people who need the housing, because that's what we actually care about. Like randomly sampling 20,000 people in the city is probably not all that helpful if you get mostly people who already own their homes and have no needs. So yeah, thanks.
No other questions or comments? Okay. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and move over to agenda item 1.2, economic outlook.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and members of City Council. My name is Monica Torres, economist with Economic Development, and I'm gonna give you an economic summary from 2025. I'm gonna go over things happening in the nation, the labor market in the city, ERT revenue, matched taxable gross receipts, permits in the city, the cannabis market. Looking ahead, a section for other and questions. In the nation, we have a number of things going on. Inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, remains elevated. The estimated average for 2025 was about 2.7%. The Federal Open Market Committee kept the federal funds rate at a target between 3.5 and 3.75 in their January meeting. The funds rate is benchmark for other borrowing costs. It has a larger impact over the short term as compared to the long term. On the long term, we have other variables that play a role, such as expectations. In their their next meeting is next week, if I'm not March 18. The future of the rate is data dependent, so it's a balance of between inflation risk and employment stability. Just for reference, in 2021, the upper limit of the federal funds rate was 0.25%. Among other things, we have tariffs. 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled that all the tariffs enacted on the AIPA law were illegal. So that doesn't cover all the tariffs, but now there's uncertainty if there's going to be refunds or not, and if they're going to happen, how is the process going to be. And also new tariffs were enacted last week. In other things, there's changes to programs such as SNAP, Medicaid. There's also going to be a number of tax incentives this year for both corporate and individual. Some are extensions of things that already were in place, some are new. Implications of tax incentives, well, some individuals might benefit, some money might go back into the economy, some might go to savings or to pay down debt. Among other things, we have changes to student loan repayment. On the global scale, there's geopolitical conflict. And last, there's gonna be a new share for the Federal Reserve this year. Now talking about the city, the labor market, we don't have data for October 25 because lapse in government appropriations. But if we compare 2025 to 2024, excluding October, we see an increase in all categories. Labor force increased 1%, employment 1%, the number of people actively looking for a job 3%. On regards to the unemployment rate, we have, during 2020 and 2021, we saw one of the highest unemployment rates in the city during the pandemic. Then 2022, 2023, we saw one of the lowest unemployment rates in recent years. There was also a number of fiscal and monetary stimulus in the nation. By 2024 and 2025, the unemployment rate increased to 4.3 and 4.4 approximately. Due to weakness in the labor market, the Federal Open Market Committee cut rates 3 times last year. At 4.4, still considered a low unemployment rate. Employment was strong in 2025. Now, if we talk about December, December is a very strong month in the city. If we compare December 25, which is preliminary and subject to change, to December 2024, we saw an increase in labor force, employment, in the number of people actively looking for a job as well, and the unemployment rate jumped from 3.9 to 4.2. DRT revenue, there was an increase of 9.6%, which is about 12.6 additional million, totaling about 143. Factors that could have contributed. Well, we had a higher rate, which already we have higher rate, obviously. But we could also seen some anticipatory response ahead of higher rates and also tariffs, which were announced on April 25. For example, if you were gonna buy furniture next year, maybe you went ahead and bought it just to prevent higher rates. We also have strong employment. We have high prices due to inflation. And again, December is a strong month in the city. This December 25 was the highest December to date. It was not adjusted for inflation, increased 6.6% to a total of 13.9 million. Matched taxable gross receipts are a measure of economic activity. The all industry sectors increased 4.4%, not adjusted for inflation, to a total of 4.3 billion. The 3 main contributor sectors were retail trade, healthcare, social assistance, and construction. Healthcare and construction increased 13% and 6%, while retail trade experienced a decline of 0.8%. Together, these sectors contribute about 57% to the total industries. Retail sector is an important sector, it's about 30%, healthcare about 16%, and construction 11%. On regards to permits, new business registration increased 24% to a total of 649. New residential construction permits experienced a decline of 12%, to a total of 571. Factors that could have an influence on this, on business and investment decisions. Well, we have a strong employment, we have consumer expectations, interest rates. For example, the 30-year mortgage rates in 2021 was about 3%. In 2025, it's 6.6%. We have wages, the average of the average, total private sector, weekly earnings, not adjusted for inflation, is about pre-pandemic levels. And that's pretty much the main contributing factors. In regards to the cannabis market, we see a decline in all the categories. Total sales dropped 10% to a total of 33 million. Medical use, about 12% to a total of 10 million. Adult use, which is about 70% of total sales, declined 9% to a total of 23 million. Transactions declined also 2% to a total of 1.1 million, and the estimated transaction expenditure, which was 30.4, is 8% lower as compared to 2024. The excise tax, which increased from 12% to 13% and is charged on adult use, declined the revenue 6.4% to a total of 721,000. This was expected because we're seeing lower adult sales. In regards to medical licenses in the county, on a year-over-year basis, we have a 4.3 decline. But if we compare to pre-pandemic levels, we're still above that level, about 14%. On the licenses, we were seeing increase on the number of enrolled patients, and when the pandemic hit, we see statistically significantly increased, and then we see a decrease when adult use sales started, which could lead to, could indicate that some of the demand will have not occurred if the pandemic had not happened. Up to date, there's about 30 qualifying conditions. And looking ahead, well, economic activity as measured by the oil industry sector match taxable gross receipts continue to expand in 2025 as compared to 2024. The pace was lower as we experienced in 21 and 22, but these 2 years were above average growth. On the regards to the labor market, employment rate initially or higher. Employment was strong in 2025. We had an increase in business registration as compared to a previous year. On the other hand, we did see the decline on retail trade activity measured by match taxable gross receipts. In the last Cruces MSA, the average weekly earnings, private sector declined 2.7%, and inflation remains elevated, which can have an impact in the labor market and in business investment. This is just a friendly reminder that every quarter we publish the economic outlook on the following link. If there's any data or additional information that you would like to see there, please let us know. I forgot to mention that we keep track of prices with the cost of living index, and in 2025, the groceries in the city were 3.3 lower as compared to the average of the participating cities. We cannot compare the index one year to another because it's different cities that participate. That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions.
Councilor Harris.
Thanks, Mayor Pro Tem, and yeah, thanks for the presentation. Question on slide 8. Actually, both questions are on slide 8. So, I mean, we just talked about housing and building more units. So we need more units, but it looks like our residential construction permits are going down. Is that like an absolute number in terms of units, or?
I think maybe I will defer to Chris.
I guess the gist of my question is, does an apartment complex count as one permit for the purposes of this, or 400?
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Harris, multifamily is considered commercial, so this would be, yeah.
Okay. So then overall, kind of is the feeling that units are still, we're still getting more units, or units have kind of leveled off, or?
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Harris, so given some of the changes in the land development code, we are seeing an uptick in multifamily duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. So we are seeing more of that. So I would expect to see some of that reflected in the numbers, as January 1st of this year was when we went exclusively to the new code. So I think over the next couple of years, we'll definitely see those units increase.
All right, cool. And then the second question is on the new business registrations. Is there a breakdown in kind of category? I don't expect you to rattle off every category, you know, by memory, but.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Harris, our software doesn't really allow us to get that granular, but what I will say is some of that isn't just new registrations versus there's been more of an aggressive effort on the part of staff to go out and make sure that those who have had expired are now getting their registration. So we can work to try and break down those numbers a little bit more as we kind of figure out industry versus renewal versus new. So we can try and get that information to you.
Okay, yeah, that's something I'm interested in, like what kinds of businesses are coming in, you know, the breakdown of renew versus new, because 649 feels like a lot of businesses to have opened for not a lot of public facing, just seeing them around town. And then also to kind of see, it would be interesting to see maybe next quarter, like the churn, if we could get an idea of it. Because, you know, it's common to see like restaurants open in a place and then run for a year and then close and then another one open. So yeah, it'd just be, I think, an interesting data point to see that churn.
Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Harris, yeah, we can certainly look at some of that. A lot of these are home-based businesses, so when you think
Sure.
businesses, you're always, and that was kind of my first thought too, was we're seeing a lot of those, but a lot of it is home-based, and again, a lot of it is maybe there's been a lapse, and so when they come in and renew, so it's not necessarily a new, it's more a
Feels
new
like it,
registration, so.
Okay, thanks. That's all I got.
Councilor Curran.
I really just have more of a comment and appreciation of you, Dr. Torres. What a time to be alive and understand macroeconomics, no? Like, can you?
Yes.
It's an exceptional moment. Anyway, I just appreciate you breaking it down as much as you can for us. And I know that that economics is a science, and I know that you know it, but also thanks for the crystal ball insight that you're trying to throw here. So I appreciate you very much for giving us this context and for us to help us understand this volatile, wild place. So cheers. Thank you.
Thank
Always
you.
happy to see you.
Likewise.
Other questions or comments? Okay, Dr. Torres, I have a couple just general questions. Looking into contract forecasts, you know, where do you think it's going to, again, your crystal ball, where do you think we're headed? It's going to increase, decrease? Also, same thing for interest rates. Where do you think those are going to, I know, but, you know, just a guess.
That's a very difficult question to ask right now, especially with the things happening. Like right now, we have geopolitical conflict. We have a major trading route that just closed that led to a 39% increase in oil prices. This could have some inflationary effect depending on how long it takes. But we're also seeing some softening of the labor market, so it's a very, and also indicators are not typically behaving like they used to. PCE, which is a preferred measure for inflation for the Federal Reserve, has been running about 2% target for 5 years. Now we're seeing PCI a little lower than PCE when it's typically the opposite case. I think most likely the interest rate is gonna kept at the current level for the next meeting, maybe a cut by the end of the year. But there's a lot of changes since the pandemic. It's been very difficult to forecast things because we've seen an unprecedented amount of stimulus. Now it's going away, but now we have other things changing. And so I probably didn't answer your question. It's just very complicated. If there's a more weakening of the labor market, probably there's additional cut in the horizon, but I think they're gonna stay for the next meeting.
Got you. Thank you. Thank you, Justice Torres. My son graduated in economics out of, I think it was 1,200 or 1,600 graduates. He was the only economics major. So conversations around the kitchen table around industrial economics and macro tables, all that was always interesting to me, and he loves that stuff. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you, Elizabeth, as well, for coordinating. Appreciate you. Other questions or comments? Councilor Harris.
Thanks. So that brought up another question I had, which also is probably a crystal ball question. How sticky do you think some of the inflation and price increases and housing price increases might be? And the context of this is I just read, to be fair, the executive summary of a study that was done in Europe. They had actually a situation where they had added a tax to a service and then a few years later removed the tax. And so the study was actually looking at the price increases and how sticky they were after the tax was removed. And basically it was prices went up immediately after, the tax went into effect, and in this case this would be our tariffs and other like housing price increases. And then after it was taken out, consumers did not see the full benefit of the reduction. So prices went up by $4. I think it was for haircuts or something. So prices went up by $4. After the tax, prices went down by $2. Anyway, just kind of curious your thoughts on that. I know that, like when I buy electronics components, I see a separate line item for the tariff on there, and that I have to pay, and so that would be pretty hard for the vendor to paper over. But if butter costs an extra $1 at Walmart, maybe it still costs an extra $1 next year. So, thoughts?
Okay, could you repeat your question, please?
With some of the changes that you were bringing up, we've seen some tariffs struck down, which obviously impact us. We've seen a lot of housing prices rise for various reasons. We're trying to increase supply and other policies. How sticky do you think these changes are? Like, do you think there's actually a chance in the short to medium term of actually seeing price decreases due to these things? It's kind of a consumer price question.
Again, a hard question. We see inflation trending down, but the level of prices still elevated. There might be some changes in regulation at the federal level that might help with home prices, but still is nothing like finalized. I don't think I have the information to fully answer your question without making a number of assumptions, and I would rather give you a more informed answer if that works for you.
Yeah, of course. That's a very complicated question, so thank you.
Dr. Torres, you could literally tell us anything and we would be like, oh yes, and that would be it. You could, we would believe you, and you're legit, so you certainly know more than we do, so just for the record. Whatever you say, we're here to hear it.
Oh, thank you.
That's the power of being an economist. All right, any other comments or questions? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then, are there any other comments or questions? If not, if there are no objections, I will adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second?
Okay, move to adjourn, second. Christine?
This is on the motion to adjourn the work session. Counselor McClure?
Yes.
Counselor Matisse is absent. Counselor Harris?
Yes.
Counselor Bencomo?
Yes.
Counselor Cran?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes,
And Mayor is absent.
we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.